The word validation has had such an interesting evolution in our lifetime. I remember when asking for validation was so looked down upon. Like, even the way we used to describe somebody who'd be asking for validation, we would say that they were seeking validation. There was such a strong negative connotation to it. Wanting validation meant that they lacked self-esteem, or they were really dependent on the opinions of other people, and they needed it just to feel satisfied with their own existence. But I think the word validation has really evolved in recent years, and it's not so outrightly negative anymore. Because of that, it seems so much more common to accept that wanting validation is a very normal or relatable feeling. And to some extent, there's even a healthy level of respect that's given to somebody who's able to ask for it. In this new age, it's not a weakness. And we've started to believe that asking for validation should not impact the perception of that person's dignity or even independence. So overall, this feels like a very positive thing. But even though asking for or seeking validation is so much more acceptable now than it once was, it doesn't mean that it isn't a very slippery slope to increasingly place weight on other people's opinions. I say this because there can be a lot of hidden information in the way that somebody asks for validation. It could seem like a simple question, but an ask for validation usually has two main things that should be noticed. The first is the intention behind the ask. It's so important to pause and take note of why this idea or thought or concern need to be validated by somebody else. Why does an external opinion matter here at all? Or perhaps it's specific to the person being asked, but why? The intention behind the ask is not always transparent. Maybe not even to the person asking. But this makes number two even more important. Number two is delivery of the ask itself. Asking for validation falls onto some spectrum where you can be perceived as, on one end, being narcissistic or having very low self-esteem, which is kind of the same thing. And on the other end, someone that's asking for clarity or to affirm what they're already thinking. And now where you fall onto this spectrum really depends on the delivery. So it depends on the wording, the tone, and even the scenario in which this validation is being asked for. So both the intention behind the ask and the delivery of the ask itself plays a role in the response that's provided by the other person. The intention part obviously is most complex, and it can only really be deciphered by the person asking. But even that is questionable because there probably isn't an objective truth. But the idea is that some aspect of the intention will reveal itself in the delivery of the question. There is so much that can hide under the guise of a question. You can have insecurities, dependence, judgment. We can end up in a bottomless pit of wanting validation unless we understand where the need comes from. It might seem like a simple question, but the compounding effects of this are scary. One of the most confounding ways validation can be masked is by framing it as advice. Asking for advice is somewhat another form of asking for validation. Advice is one of those words that has such a noble association. And this might be because there's other definitions of the word. Like advice could be professional. You can ask for medical advice, accounting advice, lawyer advice, and advice giving could be a profession in of itself. You can be an advisor, which in a way is a professional advice giver. You can do that for a company, a board, an organization, a person. And with all these associations, the word advice also gives a sense of having a very formal process attached to it. When you think of somebody asking for advice, it comes across as a genuine ask for additional perspective. And it's often paired by a lot of gratitude to the person being asked. And this formal process is what I think makes sharing advice feel so good. Think about when you yourself are asked for advice. It makes it feel like your expertise has been requested. It makes you feel so important. It makes your opinions feel valuable. And in a lot of ways, it makes it such that your sufferings or painful experiences or trauma is justified now, or it's worth it because you get to share your experience with somebody else. But that's a little bit of a tangent. Digging into that last sentence is probably good for a future episode. But anyways, sharing advice feels so freaking good. And especially if it's coming from someone who you're not that close with, it feels like, wow, they really thought of me and maybe there's something I could provide. And a question like advice makes it more likely for you to respond, giving that same level of respect you think you're getting back to the other person, which is kind of crazy. It's just simply the way a question is worded, simply the formal processes that are attached and other associations of the word that make advice giving feel so good. Now, there are a lot of similarities between asking for advice and asking for validation. Asking for advice can be just as emotional or therapeutic or vulnerable as asking for validation. And both are simple questions that kind of set the stage for somebody else to be able to wear your shoes and give you an external perspective. But the difference is very apparent in the way that we feel. When you ask for advice, it feels good. When you ask for validation, it doesn't really. It feels a lot more vulnerable. It feels somewhat like a burden at times. And similarly, giving advice feels really good, and giving validation doesn't. So it's no wonder that masking validation as advice provides a way better experience for both people involved, the person asking and the person giving the advice. But it's still very, very important to understand how asking for advice can be similar to asking for validation, because that bottomless pit that we talked about also exists here. It also exists when you want validation by framing it as advice. I only started thinking about this more recently when I found myself so stumped. I had this very tough decision to make, and I was trying to choose between a bunch of very different work opportunities. They all had different pay, they were located in different cities, and they were working with different types of people. And I found myself completely lost on what to choose. I feel like I do a pretty decent job on figuring out what I want usually, but this felt like one of the first times where I had absolutely no direction. And usually, I believe that when you're having a hard time choosing between two options, it's likely that both options are equally as great, which is a good thing, but it's also why it's so hard. But it's also why the decision that you make at the end of the day probably doesn't matter too much if they're both great paths. And you'll never really know the alternative reality. So, even though I know that, and even though I practice that, this decision felt very much like I was at a crossroad. And I found myself asking for advice a lot. And it wasn't even in the ways that I usually ask for it. It was more like I'd bring it up in conversations with my friends, or even if somebody asked me how I was doing. Okay, so, okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I brought up this dilemma a lot. I was taking every opportunity to talk about it because I thought maybe talking about it or collecting all these external perspectives would give me information that I didn't already have, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, compared to anybody I talked to, I probably was a person with the most amount of information on what I wanted and what these opportunities meant to me and how my values aligned with these or didn't align with them. So I felt like I was collecting a bunch of different perspectives and desperately trying to get more information or more insight to help me make this decision. Ultimately, I knew that at the end of the day, I'd be the one deciding. It was my decision, but I lacked the conviction in any of the options to be able to feel sure of myself. And I really thought by hearing all these perspectives, I'd be able to figure out my gut feeling at the very least. I thought if someone were to say, you should do this, that if my gut feeling were like, nah, I would know that that's a negative signal for whatever reason and I should not do that. So I was just trying to find resonance in all these opinions and all these experiences or advice that people were sharing. I thought maybe if somebody said something to me that just stuck, it would give me insight on me, how I felt, and what the situation was actually like. It was as if the opinions of others could shape my reality on what the options were on my plate. But ultimately, I realized that wanting to hear something just so that I can feel sure of myself sounds a lot like validation. And in hindsight, I knew what I wanted. I was just so scared to commit to it without knowing that I had considered all the other options. And in a way, the perspectives of all these people in my life. Because I wasn't trying to get an expert opinion or a professional opinion or even do a sanity check. I wanted somebody to tell me that I should go for the choice that I secretly wanted. I wanted that validation. I think it's important to recognize both the intention and delivery of an ask for any question, but especially when it's validation. And especially when you have any sort of inkling that it's being masked as something else. It's such a slippery slope to desperately make sense of your own life through the eyes of other people. It just doesn't work. And to make it worse, it's very much a negative feedback loop. The more you seek validation, even if it's framed as advice, the more it could lead to you being reliant on the opinions of other people. And it could lead to you wanting validation more and more, which leads to you becoming less confident in the choices that you're making on your own. And that can affect your self-esteem and the way that you carry yourself. And it just keeps going into this bottomless pit where you're so desperately seeking approval. When you don't know what's true for you, asking other people should never be the first or second or third thing you do in an attempt to find out. Collecting perspectives is great, but it's much, much more important to have one of your own that you actually believe. No other person is going to know your life or your truth or your wants or needs better than you.